Wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Morning, everybody. It's DJ NV, Angela Yee, Charlamagne the Guy. We are the Breakfast Club.
Screaming.
I know.
This is what we do every day.
Relax.
You were talking nice and low.
This is how we talk every day.
Jesus.
and it wasn't coming in hot, and now you are.
Well, now we are. We have a special guest. He served 8 years as the 44th President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, President Barack Obama.
Never heard of him.
Hey.
Never heard of him.
You know what? I heard of y'all, and I appreciate you guys having me. It's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we don't have much time, so let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
A Promised Land. Why is that the title for your book?
You know, when I think about America, I think about both where we've been, where we might be going. I'm reminded of Dr. King's speech, the famous speech he gave shortly before he got shot about, I might not get there with you, but I've been to the mountaintop and I see the promised land. And I think that idea that we're not where we need to be, but we still act on the faith and the belief that we can get there. That's how I think about America. That's how I think about my own political journey. It's not one where it's ever going to be finished. It's not one where racism is gone or inequality is gone, but we can continually try to do better. And that was the spirit that I wanted to communicate in the book.
You know, you say in the preface that America's ideals have always been secondary to conquest and subjugation, a racial caste system, and that to pretend otherwise is to be complicit in a game that was rigged from the start. So my question is, if the game is rigged and we know the fight is fixed, how could black people ever believe in this idea of America being a promised land?
Well, what I say in the preface is that that's one argument, and that's how some people feel, and obviously there's evidence of that. Slavery, Jim Crow, Native Americans being driven from their lands. On the other hand, what we also have stories of is abolition and the civil rights movement and folks fighting for their freedom and each generation passing on a legacy of struggle that results in something a little bit better. And I think that what I try to do in the book as a whole is paint an honest picture about how there's a gap between the myth of America and the reality of America. We'll never completely close that gap, but if we put in the effort, if we stay focused, if we reach out, then we can get closer to the ideal. And one of the lessons I try to teach in the book about politics is it's never going to be perfect. The fact is we live in a big country with a lot of different points of view. We've got hundreds of years of oppression and discrimination that have to be overcome. We've got the natural human impulses that you see around the world: greed, power, folks trying to get over on others. But you also see kindness, courage, folks looking out for each other, and a lot of goodness along with the bad. And in politics, the job is not to think that you're ever going to eliminate all the bad. It's can you empower the good to make more kids get a better education, to make sure that some folks have better health care, to make sure that there's less discrimination and that the police are more accountable. And if you do that and you stick with it, the distance that we've traveled, let's say just in my lifetime, we were talking before we got on the air, I'm 59, I don't feel old, and in human history, 59 years is a blink of the eye. None of us would have been sitting here 59 years ago. We couldn't imagine, you guys having your own show that you control and that you produce, and I couldn't imagine being a former president and having a best-selling book. That just wasn't in the cards, and that was just, in my lifetime. And so we can imagine if we keep working that maybe our kids, certainly our grandkids, if we do it right, they're going to be that much more ahead of the game. Now, but one thing that we always have to remember is history doesn't just go forward, it can go backwards too. And if we're not vigilant, things can get worse.
President Obama, I wanted to ask you something about Reverend Jeremiah Wright from in your book, because you've addressed it, Michelle Obama has addressed it. Do you think that in today's climate, the comments and the speeches that Jeremiah Wright gave would still be looked at the same way, where you would have had to distance yourself from him today?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, as I write about in the book. Reverend Wright is an example of somebody who, supremely gifted preacher, Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago, had amazing ministry, still does. And I was very close to a lot of people in that congregation, as well as Reverend Wright. In national politics, if you can take out a bunch of sound bites that say, "Goddamn America," even if the context of it is prophetic and biblical, and he's trying to describe, how somebody might feel. He wasn't promoting the notion that God was damning America. He was making the point that if you looked at slavery and discrimination, you could see the conclusion of people feeling that there was not an alignment with Christian values and America. But if you'd see a 2-minute soundbite, trying to explain that is too complicated. And part of what I write about is the fact that I had to, in my campaign, I had to constantly manage the fact that the truths that black folks experience on a day-to-day basis are not going to be the same as the truths that the country as a whole experience. But if you want to operate at the highest levels of politics, you have to be able to communicate and translate for the country as a whole. And there were times where I was surprised by the reaction of folks generally, white voters, to certain things that to me didn't seem like it was something they should be surprised or upset about. And I suspect attitudes would probably be a little bit different now. And to give one example that I use in the book, when Professor Skip Gates gets arrested in his own house, I write about the fact that in a press conference I'm asked about it, and I said, well, I think the police probably acted stupidly in arresting a 60-year-old professor who's got a lame leg in his own house after he's shown them ideas. Even if he cussed out the police, all they have to do is just leave, right? And that was treated with all kinds of controversy, and my polling with white voters dropped drastically because the notion is somehow I was insulting the police. I think today, in light of everything that's happened and part of what happened this summer, in terms of raising awareness of potential bias in the criminal justice system, I suspect that that would not have seemed as much of a controversial statement as it was viewed at the time, even though at the time I didn't think it was particularly controversial.
You talk about that in the Good Fight chapter, the Henry Louis Gates situation, but you also say that wouldn't have happened to a white person in the same situation. But at the same time, you said you wish you had have said that then, but you didn't. So when we bite our tongue in situations like that, who are we trying to protect?
Well, look, one of the things that I try to communicate in this book is what's the best way to expand folks' understanding, right? Where do you see teachable moments? And there have been times where, for example, the tragedy in Charleston, when Reverend Pinckney and others who were praying and invited a young white man in to pray with them, he then shoots them. He's obviously, his head's been filled up with racist ideology. That was a teachable moment where I could say some things that I might not have said in another context. And part of what I also try to describe in the book is the fact that the prophetic voice that you have, if you are a civil rights leader, if you're a Malcolm, if you're a Martin, is not going to be the same voice as if you're a politician. Because politicians, the whole thing is, I've got to figure out how do I get this white senator from this conservative state to maybe support this bill. That's different from me teaching as a civil rights leader or a movement leader. And each of us have different roles to play in that process. And I think that as one of my staff people I write about in the book when I'm running, he says, white folks, they notice you don't look like the other 42 folks that have been president. They're noticing this is already a radical break for them. And in the same way that Jackie Robinson, there were times where if he hadn't been the first, he would have whooped on somebody who's coming in sliding with spikes at him or otherwise trying to injure him. But he recognized, all right, there's some things that right now I'm going to be more diplomatic about that maybe the next African-American president will not have to be. I think those are the kinds of things that you're constantly having to measure and make decisions about.
One thing I love about the book, President Obama, is you talk about your relationship with your wife. And you talk about how your wife is the boss and you're scared of her. You also talk about how every decision has to be approved by your wife. Yeah. One thing that I love about the book is everybody talks about relationships and sometimes things seem perfect. Yeah. But in your book you show that things aren't perfect. I've been married 19 years. So when you talk about your wife and you talk about how hard it was and how she didn't want you to run, how bad did it get in the household? Did it ever get to the point where it was like, you know what, maybe this is not going to work for us, or was that never an option when it came to your relationship?
No, I think there were times where certainly she thought this wasn't going to work, and Michelle is somebody who has a different temperament than me. She is. And I think she'd admit this, she has more of a temper than I do. I think she can get more pessimistic sometimes about things than I can. I tend to be pretty even-keeled, we'll figure this out kind of approach. But as I write about in the book, sometimes that itself is frustrating to your partner, right? If you're all like, hey, honey, relax, why are you getting so excited about stuff? Then she'll be like, oh, you're just not listening to me at all. Right? And I know I listen to you. I'm just saying, it's not so bad. Well, I guess what do you think? I'm overreacting? Is that what you're saying? Right? And then you're in that pattern. Mm-hmm. So there's no doubt that there were periods, there were episodes where she was questioning whether the life that I had charted for us was compatible with what she wanted out of life. Michelle once told me something that I think summed it up pretty well. She said, I have organized my life not to have a lot of mess in my life. And politics, by definition, brings mess into our household. Mm-hmm. You've got people that I would never associate with otherwise who now suddenly are talking about us or have impact on our well-being. and that's not what I want. And I understood that, and the sacrifice she made is one that, you know, I've had to work off. You know, I've been, my debt has been.
You're still paying that tab off.
Never ends.
It's like, you know,
Never ends.
it's almost like a payday loan. You know, it just keeps on. You know, the interest was high.
How did y'all get over it? Was it therapy? Was it friends? Was it reverends? Was it church? Was it prayer?
Was it when the terms were over?
Well, I think all of the above. Michelle writes about the fact that you know, we went to counseling pre-presidency, and that was when the kids were small. And I think anybody who's had small kids, you know, that's always a strain. You know, as much joy as they bring, there is that tension, especially if both spouses are working.
Right.
And during the White House, look, I give a lot of credit to my mother-in-law because, you know, Ms. Marion, you know, Michelle would be hot, you know, she'd go upstairs. My mother-in-law was living in the suite on the third floor, and Michelle would go up there, and I'm pretty sure she talked Michelle down a couple times.
Right.
Friends. One thing Michelle and I both tell younger couples, you know, who are going through rough patches. I think we were pretty good about the fact that even when things were tough, we never lost basic respect for the other person. We never thought that person was a bad person. We never said things that would make it seem as if, oh, you just completely disrespect me. It was more, look, I love you, Barack, but, you know, this is driving me crazy. Or, hon, you know how much I respect you, but. So I think that is part of what kept us able to sort this out, because we never doubted each other's intentions, and the basic fact that, you know, my view of Michelle is, yeah, she is a remarkable woman. Even, you know, if she drives me crazy sometimes, I never thought that there was anybody who I would rather be with.
You know, being that you're so even-keeled, right?
Right.
Did you ever take your frustrations from work home? And did
No.
you ever do anything like punch a wall, or what did you do when you got mad?
You know, there were times where I would have a potty mouth in the Oval Office, but
We heard some of that in his book.
We heard it.
We heard some of that in his
Which
book.
I appreciate.
because I mean, I think it's important to be honest, because part of what I try to describe in the book is the White House, you know, and the presidency. Look, you're the leader of the free world. It's the most powerful office on earth, but it's also a job. And the West Wing is also an office, and you're going to have some of the same frustrations and mistakes and doubts and mishaps as in any office, in any job, which also means sometimes you're going to cuss a little bit because stuff's frustrating. Working out was important. You know, we get those workouts in. Sometimes, you know, a dear friend of ours who was also a trainer, Cornell McClellan, we'd get the boxing gloves out, and
Didn't seem too fun. There's a lot of older people in the White House. Like, you can't just say, let's play a pickup game. Those guys will pass out.
Now I had my weekend game though with Reggie Love,
Right.
Who, you know, and Reggie at that time was, you know, probably he just turned 30.
He wasn't posting up Joe Biden.
And so no, we couldn't play in the White House. We had our regular game. Reggie had his crew. Although, you know, who was a baller was Arnie Duncan.
Really?
Who actually played in the All-Star game a couple times. And he had played in Europe professionally, and he was my Secretary of Education. And so we had regular basketball games. You know, a lot of times though, you know, you would just try to take the long view in dealing with frustrations. If Mitch McConnell and the Republicans were blocking something for no reason, if they were playing games that actually had real consequences in terms of people being able to get health care or be able to get some relief from unemployment or what have you. You know, you just had to remind yourself that you were in a long-term contest, and there were going to be ups and downs at any given time, but that if you kept your eye on the ball, that you know, sooner or later you could prevail.
You know, in the Yes We Can chapter, you discuss how you were frustrated with the constant need to soften for white folks' benefit the blunt truths about race in this country. Do you still feel the need to do that after the last 4 years we witnessed?
Well, I think we're all a little bit more open and aware. And one of the things that I was really inspired by in the wake of tragedy was the response after George Floyd's murder. Because what you saw was not only people of all walks of life out there protesting, it wasn't just black folks. But when you looked at the polling, you actually saw that by a significant number, many more white Americans were willing to acknowledge problems in the criminal justice system based on race.
Why do we have to wait on them, though?
Well,
To speak our truth to power.
you know, what this comes down to is what I said earlier, which is how do you build coalitions to actually get stuff done? Because the truth of the matter is that in very few places are African Americans a majority of the vote. You know, it's just simple math, right? So in right where we're sitting right now in Washington, D.C., that would be the case. But there are not a lot of states, and there are a handful of cities where just the black vote delivers the power then to actually bring about concrete change. So as a consequence, then you've got to pay attention to how other folks are feeling. That may be frustrating sometimes, and as I said, that's not the job of everybody. The job of a writer like a James Baldwin or a Ta-Nehisi Coates, the job of a preacher, the job of an activist. When I was a community organizer, I'm thinking differently about what I'm communicating because I'm trying to mobilize a particular segment of my community, right? But when we are talking about politics, particularly at the state or federal levels, well, you need to be able to persuade some white folks who are not going to think like you. And you may want to say things exactly the way you want to say it, but they may not hear it.
Yikes.
And if they don't hear it, then it's not going to help you. I mean, listen. One thing that I think is absolutely important to recognize is that even people who are not in any way consciously anti-black, they don't want to be seen as the bad person. They're always going to be a little defensive. That's human nature. In the same way, by the way, that, Charlamagne, you may be able to relate to this more as a man. Like, if women start talking to men about their issues, a lot of men will get very defensive very quickly and say, that's not me. I treat my woman good, or, I'm not the problem, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Or if they're smart, they will listen and make adjustments.
Yes.
But the woman has to be allowed to be able to speak that truth to power.
Of course, but, listen.
Part of the book you talk about that. That's what I was going to ask you next.
Right.
Right, you talk about the women on your team and them having issues with men interrupting them constantly and taking their ideas and making it their own. And as a matter of fact, as that was happening, they were feeling so intimidated by it that they didn't even want to speak anymore sometimes because of that. And that was something that you guys had to address. And I feel like that's something that happens in the workplace all the time to this day. So
Absolutely. But part of what had to happen was the women had to bring it to me. Then we all had to talk about it. I had to get educated on what was happening, because a lot of times this wasn't happening in front of me. As I said, the guys would be on their best behavior a lot of times in front of me, but in meetings where I wasn't in, suddenly you had some of these macho attitudes coming up. My point is that as we think about social change, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about gender, whether we're talking about sexual orientation, this stuff is deep in everybody, right? We all have all these attitudes that have been built up over time, what we learned from our parents, what we learned from our communities, our neighborhoods. And there are times where the best thing to do is just be blunt and say, you know what, you are being racist or you are being sexist. There are times where the better thing to do is, listen, I understand, you've got your own issues, and this is, I think you mean well, but let me tell you, like, how this is interpreted by me, right? Mm-hmm. And in each of those situations, and there's no formula, right? You're trying to figure it out at any given time. How can I get other people to see my reality in a way that leads them to change their behavior, leads them to support changes in laws and institutions? And, but as you quoted, that's frustrating, right? Mm-hmm. You'd prefer not having to do this at all. I'm not the first person to write about the fact that it is sometimes exhausting to feel as if you got to educate folks about just being treated normally and fairly. I'd prefer not having that legacy that we have to deal with.
With reading this book and all that you did for every community, including our own community, right, how do you take it when you hear, especially African Americans and minorities, say that they feel that President Barack didn't do enough right. for minorities, didn't do enough for black people?
Black people.
What are your thoughts on that?
You know what? I understand it, because when I got elected, there was so much excitement and hope. And I also think that we generally view the presidency as almost like a monarchy, in the sense of, well, once the president's there, he can just do whatever needs to get done. And if he's not doing it, then it must be because he didn't want to do it.
Well, we see it with Trump, so he does what he wants to do, so people assume.
Well, right, because he breaks laws.
Right.
And or disregards the Constitution. But look, I think that anybody who goes into public life, they need to understand that, yeah, you're going to get criticized, because that's just the nature of it. If you don't want that, then you shouldn't be in that business. The good news for me was that I was very confident in what I had done for black folks, because I had the statistics to prove it, right? So by the time I left office, you had seen 3 million African Americans have health care that didn't have it before. You had seen the incarceration rate, the number of black folks in prison, drop for the first time in years. You had seen the juvenile correction system, 30% fewer people in there. You had seen black poverty drop to its lowest level since 1968. You had seen black businesses rise. You had seen black income go up. So I could just look at the data and I could say millions of black folks were better off at the time I left office than when I came in. And what I have to accept, and I think what any president has to accept, is the fact that, okay, so I got 20 million people health care, but there's still 10 million out there who don't have health care, because Republicans blocked me from doing everything I wanted to do with Obamacare, because some states didn't accept Medicaid dollars, even though it wasn't going to cost them a dime, just because they wanted to oppose me. So if you're black and you're one of those 10 million who didn't get health care because they were living in a state that didn't accept the money we were giving them, I can understand why they would be upset. How come things didn't change?
I think people want to know, like, what did you do specifically for black people? Not the rising tide lifts all boats types of rhetoric, because we all know black people's boat got a hole in it. So the systemic things that were done to black people to put us in these positions, we need specific systemic things to get us out. So what did you do in that regard?
What I'm saying, Charlamagne, is black poverty dropped faster than everybody else. Black incomes went up more than a lot of other folks. So, the issue is sometimes we just didn't go around advertising that, because once again, the goal here is to build coalitions where everybody is getting something so that they all feel like they've got a stake in it. But a lot of my policies were targeted towards people most in need. Those folks are disproportionately African American. Now, there are some things that, for example, us having a civil rights division in the Justice Department that actually took seriously civil rights and imposed consent decrees on places like Ferguson, and changed sentencing guidelines so that we didn't max out on sentencing for all nonviolent drug offenses, but changed the incentives so that prosecutors were judged not by how long of a sentence you got, but did you get a proportional sentence? Was it a fair sentence? Those kinds of changes that we made, that's why I say there's a reason why the federal prison population dropped. By the way, at the same time, the crime also dropped, right? So we were able to show that you can have a smart strategy in terms of reducing crime without expanding incarceration. But the truth of the matter is, Charlamagne, at the end of the day, there is no way in 8 years to make up for 200 years.
Absolutely.
And the question is constantly, how are you going to, the way I've been describing it, because it's very much how I understand the presidency now. You're like a relay runner. You're getting the baton from somebody else, and all you can do is run your stage of the race, and then you pass it on to the next person. And on either side, both who you got the hit from and who you're passing it to, they may not have the same priorities that you do. You know that you're not going to get everything done that you need to get done, but what you got to do is do your best to get as much done as possible, and I think that's what we did.
Would you say that your intention with this book was to explain to people also how difficult it was for you to get things passed and for people to see what you did do? Because, like you said in the book, a lot of times it's not your policies and what you do, it's more what you say and the feeling that people have, and that's what they pay attention to. So,
absolutely. Look, let's take something like the Recovery Act. So I walk in, the day I walk in, we're losing 800,000 jobs a month. The economy is actually contracting faster than it did during the Great Depression. And 6 months later, the economy was growing again, and we had kind of stopped the free fall. But if you're somebody who had lost your job at that point or had lost your house, you're not feeling good. And we couldn't go around saying, look what patting ourselves on the back saying, look at what a great job we did, because people are still hurting out there. And part of what I hope, if somebody reads this, they come to recognize, if we want to bring about systemic change, there are a whole bunch of different pressure points that we have to apply. It's not just the presidency. So I write extensively about the fact that I have a lot of power as president. I'm the most powerful person as president, but I still need a Congress. I still need to make sure that we have a majority in the House of Representatives, because if I don't, I can't get a single law passed. If I want to change something on criminal justice reform, it turns out that the federal government isn't actually in charge of most criminal law. Most criminal law is made at the state level and determined by state prosecutors. Most police departments, the federal government has nothing to do with. That's determined by the mayor in that city. Whether they're prosecuted when they do something wrong, that's up to the state's attorney or district attorney in that area. So when we think about politics, it is a mistake for us to say, okay, once I voted for president, I'm done. And I hope people don't repeat that mistake with Biden and Kamala Harris. Right now, we've got 2 seats in Georgia coming up.
Yep.
If the Republicans win those 2 seats, then Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will not be able to get any law passed that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans aren't willing to go along with.
Well, you got to do a better job of letting people know, hey, I wanted to do a lot more for people, especially black people, but I couldn't because Mitch McConnell was blocking me every chance he got.
Well, that's why I wrote the book. That's
I
why.
know, but everybody ain't gonna read. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
Like,
well, you know. But,
Hopefully they'll see
but
all
that-
these interviews.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
why I got you, man. Come on. I hear some people listen to you.
And since you're
I heard
talking
that.
about Georgia with Warnock, I see they're giving him issues about his alliance with Jeremiah Wright.
It's the same kind of stuff.
Would you
Look,
tell
look,
him he should step back and denounce him at this point?
No, look, first of all, you know, it is a losing game at this stage to just go chasing crazy commentary. You know, there's some things you have to answer aggressively, but you can't obsess over it. You know, Reverend Warnock is doing a great job. If I'm him, I'm going to be emphasizing what am I positively going to do on behalf of the people of Georgia that as opposed to just trying to play defense against a bunch of crazy stuff that's coming out there. But listen, it's hard winning in Georgia, just like it's hard winning in Iowa, just like it's hard winning in a lot of the country. And one thing I think that I hope the book also reminds us of, you know, those of us who live in DC or New York or LA, you know, sometimes we do not have a good enough sense of how big this country is and how a lot of folks do not accept at all things that we who are living in urban metropolitan areas just take for granted.
I'm from South Carolina, I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, you go, there are big chunks of the country, even in our own communities, right? I mean, so I deeply believe that people should be treated equally under the law, regardless of sexual orientation.
I was shocked you talked about that in the book.
But we all, you know, I mean, I think there are big chunks of our community where that's still controversial. People were surprised about a lot of Hispanic folks who voted for Trump. But there's a lot of evangelical Hispanics who, you know, the fact that Trump says racist things about Mexicans or puts detainees, undocumented workers in cages, they think that's less important than the fact that, you know, he supports their views on, you know, gay marriage or abortion, right?
It's hard to believe when you say this, but then you look at the way the government is ran, right? You talk about, for instance, you look at these big businesses and you look at their taxes and they don't pay taxes at all. Right. And then you look at somebody who is just getting by paying as much tax as possible. Then you look at, for instance, the pandemic task force that you created, and then you see Trump come in office and he shuts that down, and then you think to yourself, damn, if that task force was still around, where so many people have been dead, been killed, would we be able to save lives?
We would have saved some lives. Here's one simple statistic. Canada, right next door, same North America, their death rate is 40% of what ours is, right? Per capita. I don't, you know, so for every, you know, 100 Americans that have died, only 40 Canadians have died. And that's just a matter of their government making better decisions. So the question, though, is that you still had 70 million people voting for a government that I would say objectively has failed miserably in handling just basic looking after the American people and keeping them safe. Why is that? Well, part of it is because it turns out politics is not just about policy. It's not just about numbers. It's about the stories that are being told. And the story that they're hearing from Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and, in some cases inside their churches, is that, Democrats, don't believe in Christmas and, only care about minorities and black folks and are trying to take your stuff and trying to take your guns away. And, right, there's a whole story that's being told to them.
All rumors.
And people end up feeling as if, we are under attack. That, what's always interesting to me is the degree to which we've created, you've seen created in Republican politics, this sense that white males are victims. Like they're the ones who are like under attack, which obviously doesn't jibe with both history and data and economics. But that's a sincere belief. That's been internalized. That's a story that's being told. And how you unwind that is going to be not something that is done right away. It's going to take some time.
But we heard some rumors in this book, too.
Wait a minute. How different? Because, when I hear that, I'm like, damn, it feels like we're catering to white racists all the time. So I wonder how different would the Dem strategy be if we lived in a one-man, one-vote society with no electoral college?
Oh, I think that would help. I mean, look, let's take a simple example like the Senate. So Wyoming, which has about 500,000 people, has the same number of senators as California with 33 million people, right? Mm-hmm. So what that means is that the U.S. Senate basically is hugely skewed towards some of these lower population, more rural, much whiter states than the big coastal states. And that's a big difference in terms of getting stuff done. So the bottom line is that our democracy is imperfect. Changing that is going to take a lot of effort because you got to get over the hump, even just to secure our voting rights. One of the things that is still at stake at Georgia is if we controlled the Senate, then it is at least theoretically possible to pass a voting rights bill that stops some of this voter suppression and intimidation that you're still seeing around the country. And that Republicans have been pretty blatant about just saying, look, we're trying to prevent them from voting. But getting to the Electoral College, getting to the way that the U.S. Senate is skewed, that would require us also potentially admitting Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico in as states, so that, which has its own politics. It would mean having states change how they do their electoral counts.
I think the Constitution is outdated.
Yeah, 3/5, they got to get rid of that language.
I think that because the way that as diverse the country is, those people weren't at the table when they wrote the Constitution. You're a constitutional lawyer. We got to get the change in that.
Well, there is a way to change it. It's called amending the Constitution. The problem is that in order to do that, we have to have such an increase in awareness and activism. So there's a mechanism to amend the Constitution, but you just have to get everybody involved and focused in it. And this is part of the reason folks have been teasing me about how, man, that's a long book, and Michelle's was so much shorter, and there were times where I was tempted to, let me just leave out this explanation or that explanation, because folks, they're not going to necessarily want to read all that. But part of what I wanted to do was just say, man, this is the stuff that we've got to know if we really want to change stuff. Like, you have to know about the filibuster in the Senate, right? So this is a rule that wasn't even in the Constitution. This is just a rule that the Senate adopted that says you have to have 60 votes to pass legislation. You have to have a supermajority. Well, that even more empowers those little states, right? Because now they don't even need 50 Senate votes. They just need 41 to basically block anything from getting through the Senate. That's what happened to me in my first 2 years. Was I was having to get to 60 votes on everything, which meant that the number of senators that were basically representing 25% of the country had a veto power over anything we wanted to try to get done. But most people don't know that. If you try to explain to the average brother in the barbershop, man, that filibuster, that's something.
I don't know what the hell. I just thought it when people talk for a long time.
Yeah, well, but
I learned about it in the book.
well, exactly.
book, yeah.
But that thing is, which by the way had its roots. The thing that it was most used for was to block civil rights legislation and anti-lynching legislation, and that thing is still operating. We have to know how that stuff works in order for us, if we really want the kind of changes you're talking about, where we're taking away some of these barriers to everybody having their voice heard in the government.
President Obama has to go, guys. So
Right.
we're glad you cleared up some rumors,
Thank you so much.
though.
And listen, congratulations, 890,000 sold on the first day, which is breaking all
Yes.
kinds of records. So it just shows the power that you still have over
You got,
this
a,
country.
you got a little name out here.
You know what? It's first of all, I think it's because it was packaged with Michelle's book. So but I appreciate you guys. You talked about black folks and how they talked about or thought about my presidency. I will say, even at our lowest point, the amount of loyalty and folks having our back, knowing, that we were going through some, challenges. The prayer that we got, the blessings we received from our own, that is as much as anything what helped sustain us. It is something we never took for granted, and we were always grateful.
So what? One last question. What do Democrats owe black people specifically, do you think? Especially after what we just did in this past election.
Well, I think that Democrats and Republicans and America owe black folks the same thing that all people are owed, which is justice and fairness. The difference is that for black folks, that justice has been deferred and denied for too long, or it's been half-baked and insufficient. We've never done a full reckoning of what was part of the essential history and building of this country. And I think in concrete terms, I don't want to overstate what Joe and Kamala are going to be able to accomplish in this congressional environment with that much resistance, because they're going to be in a position that's probably even tougher than the one that I came in. But what I can say is, I think at the very minimum, everything they put forward, from jobs programs to small business loans to education to college debt issues, that they have to be mindful that the African American community, put faith in them, to hear them and to understand what ordinary folks are going through every day, working hard, trying to make it, and that they shouldn't be making a decision without knowing, all right, this is going to have an impact on some of those struggles to make people and their families a little more secure, a little bit better. It's not going to make things perfect, but if at the end of Joe Biden's presidency and Kamala's presidency, he too can say what I was able to say, which is people's lives are better, you know, at the end of the day, that's what you expect out of politicians.
Is there a morally correct way to do what Trump did?
Which is?
As far as, like, you know, catering to his base, you know, doing what he felt was best for his folks. Is there a morally correct way to do that?
Get more votes. I mean, the truth of the matter is actually Trump hasn't gotten a lot. He's torn some stuff down. He hasn't, there's no law that he's passed that is transformative in this country. He passed a tax cut to give away some more money to rich folks, which Republicans have been doing that for years. But you can't name a piece of legislation that he's done that has actually changed the country, even for his own constituencies. So it's always easier to tear down than build up. Building up, that requires votes. And that's why I will come on this show every time if I hear folks say voting doesn't matter. Yeah, voting will not, it's not like winning the lottery. You don't vote and then suddenly everything is great. Voting is more like, you know, washing your car or ironing your clothes. It's part of the thing you do to make stuff work. And it's part of your responsibility, and it's part of all of our responsibility just to make sure that we don't see chaos of the sort that we've just seen over the last 4 years.
Well, we appreciate you for joining us. President Barack Obama, thank you.
I enjoyed
Yes, sir.
it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
You
Yes.
look happy and relaxed now.
I feel pretty good. All right. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.